15 is called Voices of Protest. I'm going to go through it quickly, but it's on the blackboard just to sort of see how it fits with our last discussion about World War I, how it kind of undergirds this discussion of the Great Migration, which I want to talk about, and these new Negroes like Jack Johnson and others. This is a picture outside the NAACP offices in New York. Every time there was a lynching in the South, they put the flag out to sort of let folks in the North know, to kind of not let this die, that this idea that lynching was still a problem in the early 1900s. And in fact, there was a silent parade after several of the race riots. I think there's a picture of that here. What did you say? Birth of a Nation, as well as around some of the race riots, they would do these parades, silent parades. Garvey and others later might criticize them, why say things like, "Why are you being silent?" But the idea was this being this very dignified way of protesting, especially under the leadership of Du Bois, who is one of the main leaders of the NAACP at this point. NAACP is a really important organization. I want to say a little bit about them because we'll contrast them with Garvey's organization next time. Garvey's going to have a very different take on how new Negroes should respond to the things around them. So the NAACP, you read about them in this chapter and other chapters. You've already seen them and their significance. They're going to remain significant well into the Civil Rights era, but in this period in particular. Despite the successes of the NAACP, blacks generally are not the beneficiaries of other progressive era reforms. So I gave you this term progressive era last time. Basically, there are a lot of people that have a problem with this society. There are a lot of folks that want to change and improve the United States. They feel like something's wrong with progress. I remember Washington and others are talking about, let's just get on the train of progress. Get you a good factory job, it'll all work out. Some folks are saying, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not as simple as it sounds. For example, in the North, there are all these factories. Yet factories and cities generally are really dirty, dangerous places. You get all these folks together in cities of this place. There's poor sewage, for example. You ever heard the phrase, a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of? That's because folks use pots. There wasn't indoor plumbing, and then they throw it out the window. So if you're walking down the street, hopefully your mouth ain't open, to put it bluntly. Right? It's nasty places. It's just kind of germs, and you get typhoid and other things jump out because cities with so many people flocking for these opportunities, especially poorer folks, slums develop, right? The only place you can afford to live might be in a big tenement with 1,000 other people sharing a room with 10 folks, right? So a lot of folks are saying, wait a second, these cities are death traps. Right? These factories are death. They used to, put chains on the doors in these factories. Major fires break out. You get a whole bunch of people die, like the Shirtwaist Fire in 1914 in New York, right? All these European immigrants in particular die because they can't get out. They're basically locked in at work. So there are a lot of activists, progressives as they call themselves, that want to say we need to change something. Now, African-American progressives, people like Du Bois and Washington, said, look, the race problem is a part of what we need to change. But there's a larger debate. You'll see many examples of progressives trying to do various things in the society in this period. So blacks aren't necessarily benefiting from these other progressive things, and the NAACP in particular is going to take a louder voice. We talked about the 1912 election a little bit. This chapter goes into some detail. What I wanted you to know about it is that Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, is going to come out of this as the winner. Remember, he leads the U.S. Through World War I and into World War I in his second election in 1916. But he comes out promising a lot of things to African Americans. Some folks think he's going to be good for African Americans. He was a college professor. He used to be president of Princeton. So they think, this guy's going to be progressive. He's going to be a thinker. Maybe he won't be as racist, right? Yet then 3 years later, he's showing Birth of a Nation in the White House. Doing other things. What do you say? Yeah, he's from Virginia initially. So that is kind of a complicated background there. He seemed to make certain promises and not follow through, especially to people like Du Bois that found themselves disappointed by him. In fact, D.C. was an interesting place before Wilson. I just read a book and did a book review on a book about how Wilson, during Wilson's presidency, all these good government jobs in D.C. that many of them used to be held by African Americans. African Americans get kicked out of those jobs during Wilson's tenure. So again, the NAACP and others come to see this Wilson guy as not being friendly to African Americans, although
does that go on with Calvin Coolidge?
Does the mistreatment of African Americans?
Yeah.
Yeah, they called him Silent Cal. He wasn't known for doing too much, whereas Wilson seemed to be actively doing things that hurt African Americans. But yeah, none of them were really seen as super favorable to African Americans, really until Roosevelt in the 1930s. He's probably going to be the first one that's seen as really favorable. And that's why African Americans switched to the Democratic Party in the 1930s around Roosevelt. But Wilson in particular, I think probably perhaps because he made the promises first. Cal wasn't saying, "Oh, look, I ain't looking nothing for you." Then you kind of know what to expect. When folks promise you something and then don't do it or do the opposite, I think you feel it doubly, um, doubly important. So he does things like show Birth of a Nation. He was president when Haiti was occupied in 1915. It's always been a symbol of African American freedom and liberation. So a lot of folks are saying, "What's going on? Which direction is the country going?"
That was Mexico too. So.
He would become involved in Mexico, exactly, the Mexican Special Revolution, chasing Pancho Villa and others around, exactly. A lot of things that seem to not fit. And then later on during the war, he doesn't, during World War I, he doesn't seem to fulfill the promises. A lot of folks take that hard. Let me skip through some of this. Picture of the media conference and African Americans and sometimes interracial organizations that are becoming active.
Wait, that's the same thing at the Versailles conference, though.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That Wilson had promised to free the colonies in the Versailles conference. Doesn't happen. Du Bois and others go to this Versailles conference and the Treaty of Paris, thinking about this and actively advocating and don't do it. What'd you say?
Well, I guess if you think about it, though, it kind of wasn't all his fault, though.
Oh yeah, definitely not. He wanted to accomplish some things. And he did show Birth of a Nation. That was his choice. He did say the Klan was a heroic organization. That was his choice. But in terms of some of the stuff with colonies, he wasn't able to convince the world to go that direction. He actually has a stroke at the end of the Versailles Treaty, trying to convince people to sign up for the League of Nations, to stop at war, trying to do various things in terms of ending colonies. But politics is a dirty game, especially when you're working with the entire world, not just the U.S. And he has some difficulties with that. We see the Klan rise again. 1915, the Klan is reborn in the state of Indiana. A lot of folks are pointing that out now, like you said, with this whole debate about the recent laws seen as intolerant. In 1915, it's reborn, same year as Birth of a Nation, we mentioned before. Race riots, particularly during and after the war, right? Thought to make the world safe for democracy, yet there was an explosion in race riots immediately after the war. Kind of talked about that last time. Red Summer, 26 urban race riots in the summer of 1919. And these are not just southern. Some of the biggest ones are in northern cities like Chicago. Chicago has a huge race riot in 1919. So think about this. We're talking about the Great Migration. Folks leaving the South for jobs. They're fleeing things like lynching. Saying, I'm going to go to the North and get a good job. I'm going to be safe. To get to Chicago, and in 1919, it's even bloodier there than it was in the South. A lot of folks are going to be disillusioned by that. That's part of what I want you to be thinking about in terms of this Great Migration project. Yes, sir.
So it wasn't better to live in Chicago than it would have been to live
That's the question you're going to answer. That's actually the essence of the Great Migration project that I'm going to say a little bit more about in a second. I want you to think about it. Is it going to be beneficial or a disadvantage to participate in this Great Migration?
Because, I mean, the same thing happens in the Second World War, too.
It's true. That's true. Wait, hold that part of it up, because I'm gonna get to the specific project and pose that very question, right? Because it's a complicated question. Remember, I like to ask questions that may have a yes or a no answer, not just a simple answer for that reason. In terms of the Chicago riot, it's really interesting to think about this as an example of Jim Crow. All right, it's in the northern city, so it's not just the southern thing. Sometimes the South gets a bad rap, right? It's the most serious racial riot. It starts with the drowning of a black man, actually a young boy, on Lake Michigan Beach. What happens is there's a color line in the water. How do you draw a color line in the water? Well, it's invisible. It basically was this idea that, okay, blacks stay on this side of the beach, whites stay on this side of the beach. Kids are out there playing around. They float over this imaginary line. These black kids kind of float over this imaginary line. They're just playing. There's no line in the water, right?
I think no.
How do they know? Because white kids start throwing rocks at them. They hit him in the kid in the head. He drowned. This kicks off a major riot. So it's, again, remember we talk about these unwritten rules of Jim Crow. From their perspective, they had violated some serious law of Jim Crow. Right? So they killed the kid. But what's interesting about this is these are new Negroes now, right? Remember when we used to have race attacks, they would attack these communities and you sort of just had to take it. These folks don't just take it. Right? A lot of folks fight back. And it's a major race riot in Chicago. Chicago is out without law and order for 13 days. You're going to see a number of these things happen as we get later and later. Race riots are not just about blacks being attacked anymore, but sometimes they're about blacks being attacked and defending themselves. Remember that Houston riot in 1917 with the soldiers, right? Cop beat up the guy. He went and got his soldiers, and they went shot up the police headquarters. And they're like, we got guns too. Huh? Did he what? Again, is it right or wrong? I don't know. I'm not even putting sort of value judgment on it. I'm just saying it's a different response that you might have seen a generation earlier. And there are a number of riots in various places. There are, and some have been, pretty famous. Tulsa has a major race riot. What happens is the black middle class, upper class area, they call it Black Wall Street. There's a lot of upper class businesses, a lot of black money in Tulsa. Folks didn't like that, and when something happens, they burn down the city, basically. They burn down the black part of the city. Rosewood, Florida, which is an all-black town in Florida, there's a major race riot there in the early 1920s. So there's plenty of them that you'll read about, but as Rosewood mentioned. But essentially, it's interesting to think about the response. We've talked about the persistence of lynching. The NAACP is going to continue to advocate against it. When we talk about how Ida Wells is really one of the major forerunners of the anti-lynching movement, I say she doesn't get enough credit still. But the NAACP would pick that up and become really the major kind of anti-lynching organization. So you'll see some examples of that, some books they had, rallies and such. Some of the important court cases. We'll get into this a little bit later when we look at how the NAACP and other organizations are going to start to use the courts to try to achieve civil rights. Right? Obviously, the biggest example of that is going to be Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Right? That overturns Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. So is it possible to use American law against American racism? Right? The NAACP is going to start to try to find ways to do that slowly but surely. Now this takes us to the Great Migration. And we'll talk, I'm going to give you some specifics on this next time. The migration is interesting. A lot of folks say, look, this is a movement, yet it's an interesting movement. So it's some have called a leaderless migration. So you have ordinary African Americans leaving their homes and going north. Right? Normally when we talk about history, we talk about some great leader. Right? Du Bois makes a speech and all these people do this. This isn't about that. This is about ordinary people saying, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going north. I'm leaving. I'm going here, there. I'm going for a better job. So you have thousands, ultimately millions of people participate in what's called this leaderless migration, flooding out of the south, going to the north, various cities, and ultimately to the west as well, especially in World War II to the west. How are folks going to respond to this? There's a fear among many that this exodus would really endanger the South. What happens when all these folks, these sharecroppers and these cotton pickers leave? Who's going to do that work? It's interesting, right? There are all this violence and stuff. Then folks start leaving. Then you had the threat of violence to folks that are trying to leave. So many people start leaving the South that you had people at the train stations with guns, like, no, get back to that cotton crop. Like, what are you talking about? My family got lynched. I'm out of it. You need to get back to that cotton field. They needed the labor. And so it's interesting to think about the response to this. Think about it as a leaderless movement. Think about it as common people trying to control their own lives. Migration from the Caribbean. We'll talk about this more next time when we get into Garvey a little bit. Because he maybe in some ways is the most significant immigrant from the Caribbean that comes here and has a major impact. It's not just people moving from south to north. It's also people coming from outside the U.S., particularly Caribbean folks, African descended peoples Between 1899 and 1937, more than 140,000 come to the U.S. from the Caribbean, particularly places like Jamaica, but a number of other areas.
Eastern Europe too.
Eastern Europe? Oh yeah, definitely. You have, this is not just the area of African Americans moving and migrating. Immigration has opened back up generally, so all these new immigrants, as they're called, really beginning in the 1890s and first decade of the 1900s, you have several million white Europeans, quote unquote, coming. Southeastern Europeans, Italians, folks of Jewish descent, particularly from Russia, where they're being lynched essentially. And so I want you to think about some of these major examples as possible examples of the migration and its significance. The migration and its significance. Now, this idea of the Great Migration comes up a little bit in chapter 14. Obviously, it comes up here again in 15. It's going to come up again in chapter 16 in the discussion of the Harlem Renaissance. There's a number of folks that are involved in the Harlem Renaissance are themselves going to be immigrants. But there are some other interesting parts of this. Caribbean migrants disproportionately educated and skilled. So whereas most Southern and Eastern Europeans that are coming in this time are low-skilled workers, they may not have very much education, for example, and go right to work in the factories. Caribbean immigrants are, in some ways, going to complicate this notion of blackness, because many of them come with college degrees. Now, they may not be able to find jobs in their area because of racism, but they come with a higher class status than most of the folks migrating from the South. That can complicate this notion of blackness. In some ways, it might cause conflict, too, when you start thinking about conflict within the community. I mean, this is not the only group that we're going to see this. Asian Americans, for example, certain ones in the 40s and 50s, especially, say, from Korea, tend to come with high levels of education, yet not be able to work. So you have a whole bunch of, say, Korean immigrants trained as engineers that can't find work as engineers and find other work. So in Los Angeles, for example, a number of folks would open liquor stores in the only neighborhoods where they're allowed to do so, black and brown neighborhoods. This later becomes an issue, something like the 92 riots, for example. There's a lot of tension between groups. So again, it's interesting to think about how these indirect things might factor in. If you have that Great Migration handout, please pull it out. We'll go through that a bit. So I want you to think about this project that you should already be thinking about it, but I want to give you some specifics on it to kind of end here. Got a few more here. I have a few more of these Jack Johnson questions here that I found them. Circulate around. I'm going to go through it really quickly. Remember the last thing on the back page? On the back page is a quick kind of timeline of where you should be. I will just work through chapters 14 and 15, the last couple of classes. I wanted you to think about that. But I want to say really quickly how this project's going to go. And then next class, bring this back with you. We're going to get into some of the specifics of the project itself. I have a bunch of sources, for example, on Blackboard already. I want you to take a look at and see how it's going to fit. So this Great Migration project, kind of like your last writing project, is really centered on one key question. Everybody is really responding to the same basic question about the Great Migration. Your response, though, is going to look very different based on your answer to that question. So in course module 2, which is up now, it has stuff on chapters 14 and 15. It has the Jack Johnson. If it opens, I'll show you what else it has. It has this handout as well. The first part is just an introduction. It says after Plessy and Jim Crow laws, many African Americans migrated to the north, sort of telling you about the sort of background to the Great Migration. After considering both primary and secondary sources, and we'll talk about that next time, what those are and what the differences are, students will compare the lives of African Americans still in the South with those who participated in the migration. So I want you to consider this guiding question. Consider the positive and the negative. Yep.
Can you say yes and no?
Perhaps. We'll go through it and see if that's what you will think. Here's the way I frame the question, and then I'll kind of break it down really quickly. You write a position paper stating whether or not the Great Migration was beneficial or detrimental overall to those who participated in it, and including information on the long-term implications. After that, I list several themes, and I'll talk about this more next time, because what I want you to do is think about the reasons why people are migrating. The reasons why people are migrating. They are often very clear and explicit about why they're migrating. Hold on 1 second. We're going to use both primary sources and secondary sources to do that. We use the textbook, but there's also actually a whole folder here called Great Migration. I've given you most of the sources that you're going to need, and I'm going to go through them a bit more specifically next time. So starting last class, actually, what I first want you to do is to think about a main character, a possible main character, right? A possible character that's going to help you frame and talk about this Great Migration. Now, we've already discussed a couple of characters that might fit the bill. Someone like a Jack Johnson, for example. We're going to talk about Marcus Garvey. We're going to talk about Josephine Baker. All of them have a connection to this. There are several in the textbook chapter. We're going to read some letters from some, these 7 letters from the Great Migration, for example, that we'll go through next time. So be thinking about a possible main character. Now, your paper is not going to be all about this main character, but that character helps you introduce the subject and maybe answer that question of whether it's beneficial or not. So you're going to choose a main character. You're going to try to focus on a particular stream of immigration. So, for example, many people go from Mississippi to Chicago, or from Alabama to Detroit, right, to D.C. Right? D.C. and Baltimore are major destinations. So start thinking about what stream you might choose and how you might frame your question based on these things. On the back page, it tells you kind of all the, the big goals I want you to get from this. We can talk about that later, next time. Then in the middle part on the back page is an outline. I've outlined exactly how you're going to do this, right? How it's going to look. First paragraph introduction, you're going to set up the who, what, when, where. Historical context. Right, what is the Great Migration? Why are folks going to this particular city you've chosen? Who's your main character? That kind of stuff. You're going to have a thesis. Thesis answers the question. Do you believe it's positive or negative? How and why? Things we've done before, again, are coming back out in this paper. The body section, we'll talk about that a bit more next time. But basically, you're going to tell me about your sources. What sources lead you to answer the question the way you answered it. Right? Manhood or womanhood may come up in this, and it'll come up in our discussion of the letters on Tuesday. And a conclusion. So what? What comes of all this? Some people say you couldn't have had a Harlem Renaissance without first having a Great Migration. Couldn't have had a civil rights movement. Think about that for yourself. And you'll have a bibliography. The last part are the series of deadlines. Again, this is going to be due on the 14th. Got 2 weeks to do it. But we're doing various things, and have been doing various things to build up to that. The first deadline I showed you last time was to make sure you're done with chapters 14 and 15, right? Because you need Unforgivable Blackness on Jack Johnson. We've done that. Next thing you're going to do is look for Me in the Whirlwind, which is a documentary of Marcus Garvey we're going to talk about next time. I'll show you the beginning part of it. We'll talk about Mr. Marcus Garvey next time. And you're going to prepare yourself for a quiz on chapters 14 and 15. So what you should be doing right now, make sure you finish chapters 14 and 15. If you didn't do so, please do so. There's going to be a brief quiz on those 2 chapters. I think 20 questions total. What I've done is developed a study guide with possible terms and topics. That will give us the foundation to talk more specifically about this bigger project on the Great Migration. Any questions about this? Make sure to bring this with you next time, because we'll talk about this more specifically, and I want to go through some of the primary sources on Blackboard. The sources and stuff are already up, but I want to kind of guide you through them.